The smoke was wrong. Owen saw it from the high ridge where he'd been checking his snares, a pale, hesitant thread against the deep green of the pines. It wasn't the confident plume from his own chimney, nor the lazy summer haze that sometimes settled in the valley. This was the smoke of desperation, thin and smelling of damp wood and failing hope. It rose from the direction of the old miller's shack, a place no one had called home in a decade, a ruin slowly surrendering to the forest floor. The structure was barely more than a collection of rotting timbers, a place to shelter from a sudden storm, not to live. Anyone trying to make a fire there was either lost or hiding, and with the nights growing colder and the season turning, both were a short road to the same grim end. He watched it for a long moment, the wisp of gray a question mark against the vast, indifferent landscape. His dog, a scruffy hound named Buck, sat at his feet, head cocked, letting out a low whine as if he too could sense the wrongness of it. Trouble had a way of finding the quietest corners of the world. Owen had learned that lesson long ago. He adjusted the weight of the hairs slung over his shoulder and started down the ridge, his steps deliberate and sure on the familiar terrain. He moved without hurry, but with a purpose that pulled him steadily toward that fragile signal of another human life. He wasn't a man who went looking for company, but he also wasn't a man who could turn his back on a fire about to go out. The silence of the mountains was his companion, a presence he had come to understand. This smoke was a terror in that silence, a sound he couldn't ignore. He would see what it was. He would face what he found there. It was the only code he had left to live by, here, in the high, lonely places where a man's character was measured by what he did when no one else was watching. He returned to his cabin first, the scent of the strange smoke still clinging to the air. The small, sturdy structure stood as a testament to his own resilience, each log hewn and placed by his own hands. Inside, the air was cool and smelled of pine resin, wood smoke, and solitude. He placed the hairs on the preparation table, his movements economical and practiced. His gaze fell upon the stone mantelpiece above the cold hearth. Sitting there, next to a tin of tea, was a small book bound in worn, dark leather. Its pages were filled with pressed flowers and Clara's elegant, looping script, observations of the mountain seasons. He ran a thumb over the cover, a familiar ritual that brought no comfort, only a dull, persistent ache. It had been 3 years since he'd buried her on the rise overlooking the valley. 3 years of this profound, echoing quiet. The cabin, once filled with her soft humming and the gentle rustle of her movements, was now just a place of shelter. He had built it for them, a fortress against the world, but it had not been strong enough to keep out the fever that had stolen her away. He hung his rifle on its pegs by the door, his mind already turning back to the problem in the valley. The book was a reminder of what could be lost. The smoke was a reminder of what might yet be saved. He packed a small canvas sack with a block of salted pork, a handful of dried apples, and a small loaf of hard bread he'd baked 2 days prior. It wasn't charity, it was an investment in order. People who were hungry and cold made foolish choices, and foolishness in these mountains was a contagion. He whistled for Buck, who rose instantly, tail giving a single, expectant thump against the floorboards. The dog was his only constant conversation. He stepped back out into the late afternoon light, the heavy door closing behind him with a solid, definitive thud. The world outside the cabin was vast and untamed, but the world within it was his alone. A sanctuary of memory and grief he guarded fiercely. The Miller shack was worse up close. The roof sagged in the middle like a broken spine, and the single window was a dark, vacant eye. The smoke he had seen was curling from a makeshift chimney of stacked rocks, a precarious arrangement that looked more likely to set the whole structure ablaze than to provide any real warmth. And there, by the edge of the clearing, was the source of it all. A woman. She was young, her back to him as she bent to gather fallen branches, her movements slow with exhaustion. She wore a simple white prairie dress, a startling, impractical garment for this wilderness, now smudged with dirt and pine pitch. Her hair was a river of black silk, tied back loosely but coming undone, strands catching the light. As she straightened, holding a small armful of brittle sticks, he saw her profile. She was Chinese, her features fine and delicate, yet set with a tension that spoke of deep-running fear. She did not belong here. This was a place of hard edges and harder people, and she looked as fragile as a spring blossom in the path of a rock slide. He stayed in the cover of the trees, watching. She moved with a weary grace, her small pile of wood a testament to hours of labor for what would be a few minutes of fire. She paused, her hand resting on the rough bark of a pine, and looked back toward the tree line, not in his direction, but everywhere at once, as if the forest itself were a predator. He saw then that it wasn't just hardship that weighed on her, it was terror. She was running from something. He stepped out from the trees, making sure his footsteps were audible, not wanting to startle her further. Buck stayed at his heel, silent and watchful. Her head snapped toward the sound, her body instantly rigid. Her eyes, dark and wide, locked onto him, and in them he saw a cornered animal, ready to fight or flee, with no good options for either. He stopped a respectful distance away, holding his hands up slightly, palms open, a gesture of peace in a world that knew little of it. Her grip on the bundle of sticks tightened, the knuckles of her hand showing white. She said nothing, her stillness a form of defiance. Owen kept his voice low and even, the way one speaks to a spooked horse. "That wood is too green. It'll give you more smoke than heat." He gave a slight nod toward her meager pile. She watched him, her gaze flicking from his face to the canvas sack in his hand, then to the dog at his side. He could see the calculations turning in her mind. Was he a threat or a rescuer? In this place, the two were often one and the same. "I mean you no harm," he said, the words feeling clumsy and inadequate. He took a slow step forward and set the sack on a large flat stone between them. "There's food in there, salt pork and bread." Her eyes narrowed. "I have no money," she said, her voice quiet but firm, laced with an accent that softened the edges of her words. It was the first thing she had said, a declaration of pride, a wall against pity. "I'm not asking for any," he replied. "A bad winter's coming. No sense in facing it on an empty stomach." She glanced at the dilapidated shack, then back at him. "This place is temporary." "There are no temporary places in these mountains," he said, his tone gentle but unyielding. "There is only prepared and unprepared. You're the latter." The truth of his words hung in the air between them, sharp and cold. He could see the fight in her posture begin to sag, replaced by a weariness so profound it seemed to be the only thing holding her up. He knew that look. He had seen it in the mirror. He gestured toward the woods behind his cabin. "I have a wood pile, split and seasoned oak. It burns hot. I can bring some down, enough to see you through the next few nights." Her chin lifted. "I do not take charity." "It's not charity," he said, thinking quickly. "My winter coat has a tear in the shoulder. My stitches are clumsy. You look like you have a finer hand for it. Some firewood for some mending, a fair trade." He was guessing, but the careful way she handled herself suggested a life that had once known finer things than gathering damp wood. A long silence stretched out. She studied his face, searching for deceit. He met her gaze without wavering. Finally, she gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. "I am An Lee," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Owen," he replied. It was a beginning. A fragile truce brokered on a foundation of mutual need and unspoken sorrows. Over the next few days, a quiet rhythm established itself between them. Each morning, Owen would leave a neat stack of split oat near the flat stone, and each evening it would be gone. He left other things, too: a pail of fresh water from his well, a small pouch of cornmeal, a brace of skinned rabbits. He never waited for her to appear. He left the offerings and retreated, allowing her the dignity of accepting them without an audience. On the third day he found his heavy canvas coat lying folded on the same stone. The tear in the shoulder was gone, replaced by a line of tiny, perfect stitches that were nearly invisible, a mark of skill that was both beautiful and heartbreakingly out of place in this rough-hewn world. He ran his fingers over the repair, the thread smooth and strong beneath his calloused skin. It was a piece of communication, a testament to her side of the bargain. He began to see more signs of her presence. The precarious chimney was rebuilt, the stones fitted together more securely. A piece of stretched hide, likely from one of the rabbits he'd left, was pegged over the broken window, a flimsy but determined barrier against the wind. She was a survivor, making a home from ruins, fighting back against the encroaching wilderness with whatever small tools she had. He found himself altering his own routines, his path to the river now taking him along the ridge that overlooked the shack. From there he could see her moving about the small clearing, a small figure in a stained white dress, a beacon of stubborn life against the vast, uncaring landscape. She was always working, always busy, as if stillness itself was a danger she could not afford. He never approached again, not directly. Their trade was conducted in silence, a language of gestures and actions that felt more honest than words. It was a strange, distant companionship, but for a man who had grown accustomed to absolute solitude, it was a profound change. The silence of his cabin felt different now, knowing she was just down the valley. It was no longer just empty, it was waiting. The intrusion came on a bright, clear afternoon. The air was crisp, and the sun, though warm, held none of the deep heat of summer. Owen was splitting logs, the rhythmic thud of his axe the only sound when he heard it, the lazy creak of saddle leather and the low murmur of voices. It was the Driscoll brothers, Finn and Corbin. They rode as if they owned the mountains, their horses trampling the undergrowth with casual disregard. Finn, the elder, was thick-set and florid, with a mean-spirited smile that never reached his eyes. Corbin was leaner, quieter, but possessed a coiled stillness that was somehow more menacing. They reined in their horses at the edge of his clearing, surveying his cabin, his woodpile, his life, with an air of entitled appraisal. "Afternoon, Owen," Finn called out, his voice overly friendly. "Putting up wood for the winter, I see. Always prepared." Owen rested his axe, his grip firm on the hickory handle. He said nothing, just watched them. He had known men like the Driscolls his whole life, men who confused bluster for strength and cruelty for power. They thrived on the discomfort of others. "Heard you've got a neighbor," Corbin said, his voice a low drawl. He spat a stream of tobacco juice near a patch of wildflowers Clara had planted. "A little stray down at the old Miller place. A real exotic bird, they say." Owen's jaw tightened. News, or rather gossip, traveled fast, even here. "She's on her own," he said, his voice flat, "and bothering no one." Finn chuckled, a wet, unpleasant sound. "That's where you're wrong. She's bothering us. That land's been in our family's claim for years. We let old Miller stay out of charity, but we don't extend the same courtesy to squatters, especially not her kind." It was a lie. The land belonged to no one and everyone, but the Driscolls operated on the principle that a claim shouted loud enough became a fact. They weren't here about the land. They were here because a vulnerable woman was an opportunity for their particular brand of sport. "She's just trying to survive," Owen said, keeping his voice level. "Then she can survive somewhere else," Finn said, his smile vanishing. "This is a decent place for decent folk. We don't want her kind bringing trouble." He gathered his reins. We're going to go have a talk with her, advise her to move on. We'd appreciate it if you stayed out of it. It's a community matter." They turned their horses and rode off in the direction of the shack, leaving a trail of bruised ferns and a foul tension in the air. Owen stood motionless, the axe heavy in his hands, his heart a cold, hard knot in his chest. The quiet peace of the valley had just been broken. He waited, every muscle taut, listening for any sound from the direction of the shack, a raised voice, a scream. But there was only the wind in the pines and the steady thrum of his own anger. He could not go down there now. To intervene would be to escalate, to give the Driscolls the confrontation they craved, and confirm his role as her protector, making her an even bigger target. He had to trust that their first visit would be just a warning, a flexing of their perceived authority. He forced himself back to his work, but the rhythm was gone. The clean swing of the axe felt clumsy, and each strike landed with a jarring, impotent fury. An hour later he saw them ride back up the valley, laughing about something. They didn't even glance his way. Once they were gone, he took the path down to the shack. The clearing was empty. The door to the hovel was shut tight. He saw the evidence of their visit near her small, meticulously built fire pit. Her little stack of kindling had been kicked apart, the small branches scattered in the dirt. It was a petty, cruel gesture, a dog kicking over a bowl of water. It was a message. He stood there for a long time, looking at the closed door. He could feel her presence behind it, coiled in fear. He wanted to call out, to offer reassurance, but he knew that words were useless now. The Driscolls had drawn a line, and she was on the wrong side of it. He turned and walked back to his cabin, a cold resolve settling over him. They would be back, and when they returned, he would be ready. That night, sleep eluded him. He sat in the dark, the fire casting long, dancing shadows on the walls, Buck's head resting on his knee. He thought of Clara, of her fierce belief in the quiet decencies of the world. He thought of An Lee, alone in that ruin, her world shrinking to the space of a single terrifying room. The Driscolls had called it a community matter. They were about to find out what that really meant. The next day he found her coat on the stone again, along with a small, intricately woven grass basket, a silent thank you. She had not been broken. The sight of it solidified his plan. He spent the morning not on his own chores, but on a long, circuitous journey, visiting the few other souls scattered across the nearby hills. A solitary trapper named Ben, and the Peterson family, homesteaders with 2 strong sons. He spoke to them plainly, without drama. He told them what he had seen and what he expected to happen. He asked for nothing but their presence. By sundown, he told them, be there by sundown. He was there an hour before dusk, standing near the flat stone, waiting. The air grew cool as the sun dipped below the western ridge, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple. The door to the shack remained closed. He wondered if she had already fled, but he didn't think so. He had seen the strength in her, the stubborn refusal to be erased. This was her ground, and she would hold it until she was forced off. Then he heard them. The familiar, arrogant sound of their horses moving through the trees. Finn and Corbin emerged into the clearing, their faces set with smug certainty. They saw him standing there and reined in, their expressions shifting from anticipation to annoyance. "Owen," Finn said, his voice tight, "I thought we had an understanding. This doesn't concern you." "You made it my concern when you kicked over her woodpile," Owen replied, his voice calm and low, yet it carried across the clearing with absolute clarity. "We're here to escort the squatter off our land," Corbin snarled, his hand resting on the pommel of his saddle. "You'd best step aside." "No," Owen said. It was a single word, spoken without heat, but it was as solid and unmovable as the mountain behind him. Finn's face darkened with rage. He was about to speak again when another sound reached them, more hoofbeats and the crunch of boots on dry leaves. From the path to the north, Ben the trapper appeared, his long rifle held loosely in the crook of his arm. And from the south, Mr. Peterson and his 2 sons came into view, their faces grim and determined. They didn't say a word. They simply positioned themselves around the edges of the clearing, their presence a silent, collective judgment. They were witnesses. Finn's eyes darted between them, his bravado evaporating under their steady, disapproving gaze. The Driscoll's power was built on isolation and fear, on the assumption that no one would dare to interfere. That assumption had just been proven wrong. The clearing was no longer a private stage for their cruelty. It had become a public square. "This ain't over," Finn muttered, but the threat was hollow. He yanked on his reins, turning his horse so sharply it skittered. Corbin shot Owen a look of pure hatred before following his brother. They retreated back into the woods, their departure clumsy and hurried, the sound of their defeat swallowed by the encroaching twilight. The 3 men who had come to stand with him gave Owen a slow, solemn nod, then turned and melted back into the shadows, their duty done. The door of the shack creaked open. An Lee stood in the doorway, her face pale in the dim light. She looked at him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. He had not just brought her firewood. He had brought her the one thing she had lost, a shield. The immediate danger had passed, but the clearing no longer felt safe. It was tainted by the Driscolls' malice. Owen knew they would not simply forget this humiliation. They would wait, and they would find another way. An Lee could not stay here. He walked toward her as she stood in the doorway of the shack, a silhouette against the darkness within. "You can't stay here," he said softly. She didn't argue. She simply nodded, her gaze fixed on the path where the Driscoll brothers had disappeared. The fight had gone out of her, replaced by a deep, resonant exhaustion. "I have nowhere to go," she whispered, the words barely audible. "Yes, you do," he said. He looked toward his own cabin, a faint light visible in the distance where he'd left a lamp burning. "You can stay with me. The loft is empty. It's warm and dry, and it's safe." It was a monumental offer, one that would irrevocably shatter his solitude and tie his fate to hers. But the decision felt simple, necessary. It was the only right thing to do. Her eyes widened slightly, a flicker of disbelief in their depths. In her experience, a man's protection always came at a price. He saw the question in her gaze and answered it before she could ask. "No one will bother you there," he said. "I give you my word." She held his gaze for a long moment, searching his face. Whatever she saw there seemed to satisfy her. She gave another small nod. There was little to pack. A single cloth-wrapped bundle held all her worldly possessions. He helped her gather the few useful items from the shack, a small iron pot, the mended coat, the woven basket she had made. He stamped out the last embers of her fire, erasing the final trace of her time in this place. As they walked up the path toward his cabin, Buck trotting quietly beside them, the full weight of the night descended. The woods were filled with the chirping of crickets and the rustle of unseen creatures. But for the first time in a long time, the sounds were not threatening. They were just the sounds of the world turning. He led her into the warm, fire-lit space of his home. It was a single, large room, clean and orderly. The air smelled of wood smoke and dried herbs. He gestured toward the sturdy ladder leading to the sleeping loft. "You can take that space," he said. "I'll stay down here." She looked around the room, at the solid walls and the sturdy roof, and a shudder ran through her, a release of tension so long held it had become a part of her. Here was safety. Here was sanctuary. She climbed the ladder without a word and disappeared into the loft. Owen added another log to the fire, the flames leaping up, casting a warm, comforting glow. He sat in his usual chair, but the room felt entirely different. The silence was no longer empty. It was occupied, shared. The presence of another person breathing under his roof was a strange and profound comfort. Buck settled by the hearth, sighing contentedly. After a while, he heard her moving about in the loft, the gentle sound of her bundle being unrolled. Then, silence again. He must have dozed off, because he awoke with a start to find her standing at the bottom of the ladder. She was holding his canvas coat, the one she had mended. She held it out to him. "Thank you," she said, her voice clear and steady, "for everything." He took the coat, their fingers brushing for a brief instant. "You don't need to thank me." His gaze drifted to the hearth where a small stack of kindling lay ready for the morning. He thought of the first time he'd seen her, struggling with that armful of damp sticks. He looked at her, standing in the warm safety of his home, her face softened by the firelight, the deep lines of fear around her eyes beginning to ease. "You don't have to do that anymore," he said, the words carrying all the unspoken meaning of the past few days. "You don't have to be alone. You don't have to be afraid. You don't have to fight for every scrap of warmth." A single tear traced a path down her cheek, but she was not sad. It was a tear of release. Her eyes went to the mantelpiece, to the small, leather-bound book. "It was my wife's," he said, answering the unasked question. "Her name was Clara. She loved these mountains." Anli nodded, a deep and knowing compassion in her eyes. She understood loss. She understood memory. She turned and went back up to the loft, leaving him in the flickering light of the fire. He was no longer just a man in a cabin. He was a guardian. And he was no longer alone with his ghosts. The fire crackled, the logs shifted, and for the first time in 3 years, the house felt like a home again.